and welcome to the session on an introduction to critical infrastructure resilience. My name is Steve Kaufman. I'm the Section Chief for Infrastructure Development and Recovery with CISA, and I'm joined on the podium with Justin Cates, who is the Director of Emergency Management from Nashua, New Hampshire. And as we get into this a little bit, I'll explain how I got to know Justin and came to work with him. But what we're going to do is kind of walk you through what resilience is really all about, and introduce you to some of the tools that are available and how it relates to security. And then as we transition to Justin's presentation, he'll actually be talking about a case study that was run in Nashua, New Hampshire over the last, 2 years, I guess. So let me just kind of start with definition. This is the definition from Presidential Policy Directive-21, and resilience is really the ability to prepare for or adapt to changing conditions and withstand and recover rapidly from disruption. And that really takes us across a wide spectrum of things, from deliberate attacks and accidents to natural incidents or hazards. It could be changes in technology that create disruptions, and also just the dynamics of our socioeconomic system. Could be downturns in the economy, could be changes in population due to immigration or outmigration. But any of these things can create shocks to the system in our communities and in our nation. So really it's important to kind of think about resilience from a different perspective. We tend to focus on protecting assets. But when we talk about resilience, what we're really talking about is the system. And when I talk about systems, I'm including not only physical systems, infrastructure and buildings, but also the social and economic activities that take place either in those buildings or are dependent on those various infrastructure systems. It can include the natural environment, as that often has an impact on our ability to carry out our normal societal functions. And when we start thinking about resilience, we can think about it in terms of the ability to restore a function or service after disruption without a detrimental impact. So you can think about some things that are necessary to continue throughout an event because they're important to maintaining health and safety, but other things can come back a little more slowly. And so really understanding what those dynamics are becomes very important. And resilience really encompasses a number of different properties. Robustness, so being able to withstand insults. Redundancy, so if the ability to deliver a service is unavailable, is there another means? Resourcefulness, and you see this oftentimes after natural disasters where people come to the aid using innovative means to rescue or restore systems. And then finally, recovery, which is that long-term process of getting from the disrupted state back to a state of new normal. So security and resilience kind of play hand in hand, but there are some differences. Infrastructure security really is defined as reducing the risk to critical infrastructure by physical means or defensive cyber measures from intrusions, attacks, or other effects of natural or man-made hazards. And that can include things like identifying, deterring, or disrupting or preparing for threats and hazards, as well as reducing vulnerabilities. Resilience, on the other hand, really starts to encompass a broader set of risk management and preparedness activities. And it expands from just looking at threats and vulnerabilities to considering what are the consequences if those vulnerabilities are exploited or tested. Security generally tends to be focused more internal to an organization. Resilience looks outside because there are dependency relationships that exist outside the fence of a facility that can affect the ability of that facility to operate. And resilience also includes anticipating and preparing for events that security interventions can't prevent. So that could be things like natural hazards that could pose a risk to or a threat to disrupting the operations, but they're not something that security can necessarily deal with. So when we're talking about resilience, context becomes very important. And what that means is that we need to understand why functions are important to the local community, the region, or even in many cases the nation. How are those services delivered? So are there buildings that are involved? Are there infrastructure systems that those buildings are dependent on to operate? What are services dependent on? So if you're thinking about something like a water treatment facility, it's dependent on electric power, communications, access via transportation networks to provide chemicals to actually treat water. There's a source dependency. There are pipes and equipment that are required to distribute the water to consumers. And then the question becomes, how long can that service be interrupted without any adverse impacts? And are there temporary measures that can deliver this service until a permanent system is restored? So as we start to think about how you apply these principles in practice, it's important to start with defining the scope. And we'll get into this in a little bit more detail in a moment, but there are often times when you define the scope, there are often things that exist outside the scope of your the problem that you've defined, and you need to be able to think about how to deal with those things that are dependent on external operations. It's important to form a collaborative planning team, so this includes a core group of people who are going to do the work of putting together a resilience plan. It's also important to bring in the stakeholders who have a role to play in resilience, and you'll see some examples of this later. You have to know what's important and why is it important, and actually, who is it important to? What are the dependency and interdependency relationships that exist? What are the risks that could be present, whether those are natural hazard risks or maybe technological or human-caused risks? And then you take that and develop and execute a resilience plan, and you use that plan as a baseline to measure progress over time. I actually came over to DHS almost a year ago from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, so I've been at this for probably about 8 years now. And when I was at NIST, we actually had developed what we call the Community Resilience Planning Guide. And what NIST did in that guide was really to link social and economic functions to buildings and infrastructure. So in any community, there are 8 social dimensions that you can identify, and they range from things like government to neighborhood, which includes housing and things like that, education, health, and so on. What we did in that guide as we were preparing it was to limit it to a defined geography. So we used the local community as that geographical boundary definition. And we did that because, one, it gave us a way of simply bounding the problem, but it also meant that there was a clear governance structure in place. And that meant that you had a convening authority that was able to bring the stakeholders together. It also meant that you had an entity that could actually make decisions or at least influence decisions based on the importance to the community. And what NIST did in that guide was take those social dimensions and link those to buildings first, or building clusters, and then to the infrastructure systems that they were dependent on. So you could build out kind of a mapping of these dependency networks and really start to understand how the dependencies influence the ability to restore the whole system following a disruption. At DHS, we're really often more interested in looking at things at a regional perspective. And that means we can transcend the local boundaries. We can consider shared infrastructure dependencies and interdependencies. So you can think of things like electric power generation, which is generally done at a regional scale. You have local communities that are dependent on it, but you have the shared network that's involved. You can consider single infrastructure systems or sectors at that regional scale, or you can start to look at how things interact. So some examples of the kinds of things that we might think of at a regional scale include ports and multimodal transportation systems. I mentioned the electric grid. and regional water or wastewater systems that actually serve more than one locality. DHS, over the past couple of years, has developed what's known as the Infrastructure Resilience Planning Framework. And similar to what the NIST framework, our guide, had done, it lays out a process for understanding or planning resilience for infrastructure systems. So it includes a comprehensive step-by-step planning guide. We have a number of templates for aiding a user through the process of bringing their collaborative planning team together, identifying critical elements of the infrastructure. We have a number of other resources for things like identifying funding sources for actually being able to pay for enhancements. It's a 5-step process, whereas the NIST process is 6. Oops, I'm sorry, very sensitive button. But it takes you from that stakeholder engagement component through risk assessment and implementation. If you're here tomorrow or on Wednesday, Will McNamara, one of my colleagues who's here in the audience, and I will be talking about the work that we do in the Infrastructure Analysis and Assessments branch. And we'll be talking about how we actually have combined or kind of built on what we've done historically over assessments over the last several years into this overall planning framework. But we really take you through bringing the stakeholders together, identifying the critical components and building that dependency network, understanding what the threats or hazards are that exist, what the potential impacts are, and then developing a plan to actually address and reduce those threats and build resilience over time. Okay, so as we start to think about defining the scope, one of the things that's really important, and Justin will talk about this, I think, in his presentation, is to really identify what are the implementation vehicles that resilience enhancements will feed into. Those can be things at the community level, like a comprehensive plan, economic development plans, hazard mitigation plans, and I think what's becoming more and more apparent, they can feed into response and recovery plans, because particularly recovery is where there's resource available to make some significant improvements in resilience. Business continuity plans can also be a valuable vehicle for implementing resilience enhancements. So if you're thinking about maintaining a business or a manufacturing concern, being able to look outside the fence and look at how various factors influence your ability to conduct business can feed into a plan for that operation. Implementation also needs to consider alignment and integration of plans to identify and resolve conflicts that create vulnerabilities. I think, Justin, you may talk some about this in your presentation. And you also need to ensure that plans are feasible when you're considering external dependencies. So are those plans going to work? Are you able to have the impact or the effect on those externalities that will help you make your plan operable? Next step is to form the collaborative planning team and identify stakeholders. Picking a leader is really important. A leader really needs to be someone who can work across boundaries, work across the silos, bring a diverse group of stakeholders together. You need to have people who are going to be willing to do the work of actually developing the plan, and then the stakeholders who are going to inform that effort. When you start to look at what's important and why, starting at the local community, so social and economic dimensions, what's really important to the community, what's its identity, how are those things dependent on buildings and infrastructure, and what are the dependencies on infrastructure services that exist outside the boundary of the local community. So there may be things like a major employer that exists across the border, but many of the employees live within the border of the neighboring community. So there is certainly dependency in getting people moving back and forth on transportation networks. Regional, national scale, so this can be, again, shared infrastructure. There could be regional infrastructure to multiple communities, and there could be supply chains transportation networks that really exist at that much larger scale that become very important. I'm leaving this meeting on Wednesday to go down to the Virgin Islands for a workshop, and in the island scenario, they're completely dependent on the mainland for supplies. And so one of the things we're going to be kind of walking through in the workshop with them is looking at that local scale, what's important, building up to the territory, and then really starting to look beyond the territory to the mainland and beyond to make sure that they understand what they need to function. This is just an example of kind of thinking through how these interdependency relationships work, but it's important to really start with understanding how the system is connected before you do anything. So what are the assets and the systems? What are the really critical nodes that are important? What are those things dependent on? So here in the water example, you can see that there are a number of kind of primary things that the water treatment is dependent on, and then there are a number of secondary items that they're dependent on to be able to complete the service of delivering water. So we map those relationships, including thinking about who or what's dependent on the infrastructure, and then define what the desired performance should be based upon the priorities and the importance of the facilities and systems. So that gives you a baseline of what you want a resilient recovery to look like. And then this is just an example of a regional network. But as you go through that risk assessment, you can really start to think about when things are likely to be available, given the various hazards and the various intensities of hazards. How are those threats expected to affect the infrastructure? So what's the extent of damage? What's the duration of the expected disruption? And what are the consequences of that disruption? And then you can identify and prioritize those resilience gaps. So here in the example, you can see, looking for a pointer, but it's here. This is when the system is desired to be fully operational in this case. It may actually, as you go through your analysis, it may be something less than that. So that begins to identify gaps where you can begin to apply resources and enhancements. And then the development of the plan and the execution. So you want to begin by taking that prioritized list of gaps and identifying potential solutions to mitigate the risks. Those could range from engineering solutions. They can be policy solutions. If you're talking about the community scale, it could be things like changes in land use planning that remove facilities or buildings from risky areas. Identifying and assessing existing resources and capabilities to implement mitigation measures. So that's really starting to look at what are the resources that you have on hand versus can you apply for resources from the state or even the federal government to assist you. Selecting resilient solutions, developing that implementation strategy, and then once the strategy is developed, looking for opportunities to implement that strategy through the appropriate vehicles, and that comes back to the existing local plans. And then finally, measuring progress over time. Is the anticipated performance of the infrastructure and buildings moving toward a desired state? So are you closing those gaps? You want to make resilience an integral part of planning, design, construction, operation, and maintenance of infrastructure. So the idea of taking this kind of holistic approach, working with the existing planning documents as the implementation vehicle, is really to start baking this concept of resilience in and thinking about things in a different way so that it becomes a part of the normal operation of the community or the infrastructure system. So finally, just in conclusion, resilience really requires considering the asset or system within that larger context. Why is it important? What are the dependency and interdependency relationships that exist? What is the consequence of disruption to any of those assets on the rest of the system? Resilience complements security. So security looks internally at protection of a facility or community, and resilience looks externally at the things that will impact the ability of the community or the facility to operate. And then finally, resilience is really built at all levels. So it starts thinking about those systems, scaling up to the community and the region and beyond. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions, and then we can transition over to Justin's presentation. Yes, I do have a microphone. So.
Is this working? Yes. So in regard to your resources, how is the allocation? Is it government, local, state, federal, and tribal? Is it specifically government vendors, or do you work with other organizations? And the second question is, where does all this fit with FEMA? Where does all this fit with FEMA?
So I'll start with the second question first. So we do actually work with FEMA very closely. So we are working on a variety of things. I sit on the Mitigation Framework Leadership Group. I've been co-chairing the National Mitigation Investment Strategy. So a lot of the things that we're talking about in resilience can feed into the things that FEMA is doing. And we do have a project right now that is really looking at how do we do a better job of looking at hazard mitigation planning by incorporating resilience concepts into mitigation. So we are working closely with our partners at FEMA. With respect to your first question, the answer is sort of all of the above. The idea really behind resilience planning is to take that holistic look at the community or the region, and then once you've identified what the issues are, what potential solutions are, you can start to look at what the various funding streams might be. So it could be that it's something that a local community can kind of build into a capital improvement plan. It could be something that FEMA might fund through a hazard mitigation grant at the federal level. There might be state dollars available depending on what it is. So the idea is really to start to open up the range of possibilities to fund the resilience measures.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Justin Cates, Director of Emergency Management for the City of Nashua. And really my portion of the presentation is going to talk a little bit about how we took this concept of resilience and integrated it into the way that we plan for emergencies, as well as how we plan for the future of the city. So this will be an opportunity to see how this actually can be implemented in your jurisdiction or you as a partner with a jurisdiction that you may have a facility in. So a little bit about Nashua. Nashua is one of those historic New England mill cities. We're located about an hour northwest of Boston. 89,000 for our population. We are the second largest city in the state. And our major industries, healthcare, information technology, defense contracting. We do have BAE Systems as a pretty sizable facility, 2 facilities within our jurisdiction, as well as a number of other defense contractors. And then retail. We're tax-free in New Hampshire, and we're right on the border of Massachusetts. So where do you think all the Massachusetts folks go to shop? Nashua. So definitely a big part of our economy, and as we went through this process, we identified some vulnerabilities to that specific sector. One other unique thing about Nashua is we're the only local government within the state of New Hampshire that has a full-time Office of Emergency Management. So in New England, one of the things that you'll find, with the exception of Maine, most emergency management is done at that local level because counties are meaningless borders. So that's typically done as a collateral duty to a fire chief, a police chief, a volunteer in those small community cases. Might have been the selectman that didn't show up for a meeting, and now he was appointed as the emergency management director for that town. So we're in a unique position here, which allowed us to have the time to dedicate to putting on a process like this. So Nashua's path towards resilience, we had been looking at the concept of resilience for a number of years prior to us implementing our community resilience process because it was becoming a buzzword in the city, it was becoming a buzzword in the state and at the national level. One of the funny things that happened after a mayoral administration change in the city was all of the people that I was working around in the mayor's office were all moved out when the mayor changed, and I was the only one left behind. And it got me started to think about, is the work that I'm doing in emergency management, is it really baked into the city so that if I were to have been taken out with this mayoral administration change, would the stuff that I was working on still be there? And I thought at the time, the work we were doing in emergency management wasn't really that way. We hadn't done enough work to really bake it into our community planning, our engineering, code enforcement, and all the other aspects of emergency management and city management in the city. So we were really at the right place at the right time. We were required to update our FEMA hazard mitigation plan, 5-year update. And as Steve had mentioned, that's one of those plans that may serve as an opportunity for you to plan around the concept of resilience. So we saw this as an opportunity for us to look at baking resilience into our mitigation planning. And we also were able to obtain some funding through Environmental Protection Agency, FEMA through the mitigation planning programs that they have, as well as the National League of Cities through their Resilient Cities cohort. We had noticed that our previous hazard mitigation plan really didn't see the types of impacts that a mitigation plan would hope for. Many of the actions that were recommended in the strategy were never actually implemented. So we thought we have to figure out a different way to approach this problem. And we also saw some significant growth in areas which had significant hazard exposure. So with us being a mill town in New England, you've got a lot of old mill buildings that are prime for redevelopment as apartments or commercial spaces. Unfortunately, those are properties that are in the floodplain in most cases. So how do we promote economic development while also promoting community resilience? And that was something that we were struggling with at the time. So why we went with community resilience versus a typical hazard mitigation planning process. And we saw it as a couple of different areas that we looked beyond. So the first one is we looked beyond natural hazards. Natural hazard is really the only thing that's required as part of a hazard mitigation planning process. So we looked at technological hazards, human-caused hazards, mainly because those were concerns for our community. We also looked behind that 5-year planning horizon that's typically required for mitigation planning. We started looking at climate impacts, aging infrastructure, all the things that might go beyond that 5-year planning process. We also started looking beyond acute shocks. One of the impacts that we see significantly in Nashua, but also across New Hampshire as a whole, is the opioid crisis and how it impacts our emergency services as well as our healthcare system. So we were able to look at that as part of our community resilience planning. Among other things, aging infrastructure and some of the other issues that we dealt with related to housing crisis. We also looked beyond emergency management specific plans, looking at our master plan, our comprehensive plan, looking at our economic plan, and how those either conflicted or served as opportunities for collaboration as we built out our community plans. And then also we looked beyond communities, we looked beyond strategies that promote solely risk reduction. And that really brought us into that concept of co-benefits or the resilience dividend. What are the things that we can do that not only reduce risk, but also have a benefit to the community every day? And one of the challenges we deal with as an emergency manager, many people don't want to put money towards emergency management because that emergency may never happen. So why are we going to put that investment in when we really may never end up having to use it at all? But this example of a transit system is really a good look at the resilience dividend in action. So the transit system reduces harmful emissions, so it's climate mitigation, looks at how it might connect people to jobs in the community, but then it also serves as an emergency capacity if we needed to evacuate a certain area of the community. So looking at co-benefits was a better way for us to justify investments in the city. Another example, the Eisenhower Interstate System. You look at how that was implemented as really a defense mechanism for the United States, but look at all the economic benefits that it provided across the United States. So when you look at co-benefits, it's an easier way for emergency managers to promote their initiatives. So as Steve had mentioned, the NIST process was really one of the ways that we framed our mitigation planning, and we had a number of really great partners that provided technical assistance and funding throughout that entire period of time. But this 6-step process is really a great way for you to look at how you might be able to integrate this into a master planning process or an economic development planning process. And we had a part of this where we were actually testing it out. Where did the different pieces of the NIST process fit within hazard mitigation planning? And we figured it out, I think, at least a test of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the areas that we worked on and how they relate to Steve's efforts to try and provide us with the fundamentals of critical infrastructure resilience. So when we talked about the scope or the planning area, ours was really focused around the city of Nashua. But it's important to know that there are many things that go into community resilience that are outside of our borders. We might look at important employers. We might look at electrical generation. Those are things that we don't have an impact or an influence on in the city of Nashua, but if they were to have been lost, it would be significant to the city and its livelihood. So one of the things that we had to do was balance the requirements of planning for the city of Nashua as part of our hazard mitigation plan, but then bringing in those stakeholders from outside the city, at the region, at the state level, and ensuring that they could provide us with insight as to the impacts beyond our borders. And this was an effort that was done jointly between the Community Development Division and our office. And we saw ourselves as a cultural broker to try and convert the emergency planning stuff into community planning stuff. And it helped to have the community planners there to provide that insight as to how some of this stuff would actually be integrated into the future of the city. And we had great technical assistance from a number of partners, NIST being one of them. That's how we partnered with Steve for the first time, the Northeast States Emergency Consortium, Texas A&M University, National League of Cities, and the Resilience Dialogues program. And trying to find a fit for them in this entire process was a challenge, but they all provided great support for us. The planning team. So Steve had talked about some of the different levels of planning that would be involved in this. Our core planning team was the Office of Emergency Management, Community Development, and a number of the departments within, so urban programs, community planning, code enforcement, building safety. We also had economic development, public health, and those were the focal points of the people who actually wrote the plan. Well, we ended up writing more of the plan. They really were the key stakeholders in helping us to guide the plan. The steering committee, which is really the picture you see up there, about 50 people, was a larger group that consisted of all the city departments, many state stakeholders. We had our protective security advisor for the state of New Hampshire involved. And those were folks that provided insight on their specific piece of the puzzle and provided us with resources and assistance when necessary. And then the last one, community stakeholders. That was everybody. As through this entire process, we continued to provide updates, ways for them to interact with our group. And because it was a hazard mitigation plan update, it was required to be involved with the public. Everybody had to have an opportunity to speak on behalf of their community or their population. One of the things that was important as part of this, and the NIST planning process, the performance goal table is shown there on the screen. One of the things that this steering committee did was identify those green blocks there. And what that was were those important things, social institutions within the community, that they wanted to ensure were up and running after a disaster. So as an example, gas stations. They might say, we want to see those up and running, 90% of them, within 3 days of the incident. And that consensus then built this initial part of the table. And it guided our discussion as to what was most important to the community. And I think not only for a hazard mitigation plan this was important, but this would be helpful for a master plan or a comprehensive plan in a community. And then there were cases where we worked individually with specific infrastructure stakeholders, utilities, wastewater, water, all of them we met with individually to get more insight as to the impacts to their systems. The outreach strategy. So how did we get out to all these people that would show up at our events? Well, one of the things that we did was we looked beyond the typical people that would show up at a hazard mitigation plan update, which were community engineers and the emergency manager, and that was basically it. Nobody else shows up to the meetings. And really, when you look at it and you look back at it, you say, well, was that worth the time that we sat there and wasted on this? We had the opportunity to invite people like the soup kitchen, the country club, the city engineer, all the way to the civic hacking club that would build little sensors for flood tracking in the community. It was a really neat way for us to bring a number of different mindsets to the table, and some of the ideas that they had were really innovative. We used community television shows, social media, and one of the things we were most proud of was our Co-Urbanize page, which was a crowdsourcing initiative to get community input on the hazards that they experience in the community, but also recommendations. They were able to provide insight as to actions that they would like to see implemented within the community. Maybe an area where they want to see the levee improved, or area where there's drainage improvements that can be made. And then for all of our documentation, we used collaborative documents like Google Docs to enable the citizens to actually go in and make corrections to our spelling, which was, a great way to get the community involved. One of the things that we also did was the Resilient Nashua Summit, which enabled us to bring in about 150 community stakeholders to hear from some of the thought leaders in community resilience across the country. And that was a great way for us to get people excited about community resilience. One of the things that was discussed earlier in Steve's presentation was the areas where different plans might conflict. And we worked closely with Texas A&M University on a process that they have that's called the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard, where you look at the multitude of community plans that you might have within your jurisdiction, ranging from transportation plans, master plans, hazard mitigation plans, and you actually go through the process of reviewing every single one of them and doing an audit. And what you'll find is each of those plans conflicts in many different ways. Economic development plans want to put people into harm's way, and hazard mitigation plans want to get them out. So how do we ensure that we're working together on our planning efforts? The Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard takes all of those policies that have been recommended, scores them, and then helps us to identify geospatially the areas that we're putting people at most risk within the community. And this is a free resource that Texas A&M has, and I'm happy to share this with you. Another requirement that we had as part of the mitigation planning was to identify the existing capabilities we had as a city. So what was our building code availability? What other actions and staffing that we have already on books that would enable us to help reduce risk within the community? So this process helped us to meet those FEMA requirements. The risk assessment. So Steve talked about the different things to look at when it comes to a risk assessment. And when we did our risk assessment, we used a tool from FEMA called ASIS. It's a modeling tool. It is very focused on hurricane, flooding, and earthquakes, but it did provide us with some insight to assist us with determining functionality of infrastructure within the community, which is a part of the NIST process. One of the things that our stakeholders had a challenge with was what are we trying to calculate when we look at probability? Are we looking at the probability of a warning? So how many times are we warned that there's a tornado that's going to be impacting our community? The probability of actual occurrence of that tornado, or the probability of loss from that tornado? And typically hazard mitigation plans look at the most simple way of it is disaster declarations. And that's not really a good estimate of the risk that you have within your community. So we used a number of different data sources to help us to get a better indication of the actual risk that we had within the community. You can see in the map there on the right, economic losses for buildings by census block. That's one of the reports that'll come out of HAZAS, and you can see some of the areas of dark red. Those are some of the retail corridors that I had mentioned earlier. So it helped us to understand the impacts to some of our significant economic drivers within the city. But this was a big part of it, and it actually took the longest out of our entire process. So now that we got to this point, we were able to go back to the NIST performance goals tables and identify the anticipated performance of our structures. So our community stakeholders said we want the gas stations open by day 3, but our HAZAS results show that that's probably not realistic. It's probably going to be more like a month. So now we have a better understanding of the gaps that we have and the areas where we can promote mitigation actions or adaptation actions within the community. So the final piece of our planning process was the actual mitigation and resilience strategy. So this is where we had all of our community stakeholders provide us with input as to things that they would recommend that we do. Our subject matter experts for the community, our engineers would provide insight as to the things that were reasonable and realistic for us to implement. And we also looked beyond FEMA's typical requirements for a mitigation strategy, and we looked at social programs that could be implemented or preparedness initiatives that could be implemented. So these are beyond what FEMA is grading when they're looking at a mitigation plan, but these were things that the community stakeholders were bringing up at the meetings. So we didn't want to just write them off. We wanted to have a way to document them and look at ways that we can implement them in the future. One of the things that we actually looked at as part of our strategy was a program called Resilience Dialogues, which is an online platform that's done by a number of different organizations, the American Society for Adaptation Professionals, the U.S. Global Change Program. And it's an online platform where subject matter experts from academia and other government agencies from around the country provide insight as to best practices for the issues that you're dealing with in your community. And it's an online platform where our core planning team worked in conjunction with all of those subject matter experts to come up with reasonable strategies that could be implemented within our community. And we took every single one of them and put them in our plan. So it was a unique way to get some insight from outside of the city of Nashua. So how are we going to keep this process moving forward? So the past 2 years we had been working on this plan, and we just recently released it. And it really ended with the recovery workshop and tabletop exercise. Because we, in the initial stages of this process, determined our desired performance for buildings and infrastructure, we had an understanding of what we wanted to see the community look like after a disaster. So we took all of that information and we took our anticipated results from ASIS and did a flood scenario where we looked at the actual impacts to the city if we were to see a similar 1936 flood event in Nashua. What was interesting about this process was we brought the recovery support functions from Economic Development Administration, FEMA, all of the other players, HHS, that have a responsibility for building the recovery planning process after a disaster. And they gave us insight as to the funding streams that might be available, the technical assistance that might be available for this scenario so that we can get back up on our feet better. And then the last piece where we're going to look at how we're going to keep this process going is we're going to start the master planning process in the city. And all the work that we did as part of this mitigation plan is going to be included in that master plan. And we've built up now a cadre of people who are interested in seeing the community move forward, but in a resilient way. So we're really happy to be involved as much as we're involved in the Imagine Nashua 2040 project. And I don't think if we would have gone through this process, I'm not even sure we would have been invited to the table. So what have we learned? There was an essential need to get buy-in from critical departments. Economic development really didn't see their role in this process. Engineering, and even in some cases, were stretched with time, and they said, is this really an important thing for us to be involved with? So really important. And also having support from your mayoral administration or your city manager, your county administrators, whoever's, whatever jurisdiction we're talking about here. And then this has led to better coordination between many of those other entities involved in code enforcement, engineering, public health that we would have never had before. And an example of that is we're currently working with FEMA and USGS on the update to our floodplain mapping. So as you go through the risk map process, you identify areas which are going to see now properties go into the floodplain. Well, we identified a number of areas that were possible locations for new development and apartments and things that would help to deal with the housing crisis, but now they were going to be in the floodplain. So it allowed us to work closely with community development to try and find ways to mitigate that hazard. And then I think the other key thing that I learned is resilience takes a skill set far beyond emergency management. Emergency managers across the country typically come from fire, law enforcement, the military, but we know that resilience needs a whole slew of other skill sets: risk management, engineering, an understanding of critical infrastructure. And that was something that I learned as I went through this entire process. And then the last piece was we need to assist those individual facilities and campuses with their efforts to become more resilient. And we built, as part of this process, the Resilient Nashua Toolkit, which took all of the resources that we thought were the best in the industry to help those facilities develop great emergency plans, continuity plans, and ways that they can do mitigation actions at their own buildings. So I'd be happy to answer any questions in conjunction with Steve.
As a local emergency manager, how do you proactively engage your private industry who are really important to the functioning of your community in these kinds of efforts?
So the best way that I have to engage with the private sector is through our local emergency planning committee. So EPA requires, as part of the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, local emergency planning committees. And that brings a number of our critical industry partners to the table. Those are people who have some sort of a hazardous material on site. But what we found is that we can use that as a framework to get additional industry and private sector partners on board. And what we did to expand that concept was, you've probably heard of the idea behind business emergency operations centers now. They're typically done at the state and national level. Well, we did a similar initiative at the local level where we put a person from our economic development office in our EOC to help those folks during incidents, to serve as a private sector liaison. So they saw a benefit to being involved in the planning process in advance, because they had a one-stop shop during an incident to get the road opened back up or their power restored or whatever the case might be.
Other questions? We still have plenty of time, so don't be shy.
Yep, one question over there.
So what was the interaction with NHEMA, with the New Hampshire Emergency Management Organization? Since you were doing just Nashua, how did that interface with the entire state's planning?
Sure. So at the same time, the state of New Hampshire was also going through their 5-year hazard mitigation planning update. So we did have the opportunity to engage with them on a number of occasions to talk about what we were doing and what they were doing, data sources that we could share for our risk assessment. One of the things that we did have the ability to do that I don't think any of our other communities in New Hampshire had for the same process was, we had active participation from not only the state Homeland Security and Emergency Management and their mitigation staff, but also a number of other state agencies that had a mitigation role. I mean, we had the turnpike that goes through the city that we're not responsible for, but there are certainly efforts that can be made there to help try and reduce risk for that structure, that piece of infrastructure. And they were involved in all of our meetings. The Department of Environmental Services was a big partner. So I think we had participation from the state as well as the state emergency management much higher because we had such an active process.
Other questions? None.
Nice. Well, if anybody's interested, I do have my cards up here, and we're happy to share any of the resources that we use through the entire process. And I'm sure Steve has a number of other resources from his office as well.
Well, thank you very much, everyone.